Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's up, guys? We are back with part 3 of the Bloodlines of Jesus conspiracy. And today we're going to get into specifically Joseph of Arimathea and what these Gnostic groups were saying about Joseph of Arimathea and how they actually tie him into being James the Just, which was the brother of Jesus. I'm going to show you how they try to overlap this and how also it doesn't work when we're talking about James, the brother of Jesus, and how somehow he was outside of what Pauline Christianity and what Peter were trying to build, and how in actuality the scriptures show us that James was working in conjunction with them. And I know I talked about that on episode 1, but we're going to go a little deeper at that today. We're going to talk about Scoda today too. We're going to explain who she was. There's 2 different origin stories, but we're going to talk about how that directly ties into these Davidic bloodlines that are said to be in Scotland and also Ireland. And then we're going to end it with the Merovingian dynasty, which is one of the most important dynasties when it comes to this supposed messianic line of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But we're also going to talk today deeper about what's actually connected to all of these bloodlines. And we're going to see a theme, a Nephilim theme that's involved with these bloodlines. And after this episode, we'll have one more part of this Bloodlines of Jesus conspiracy. And then that last part, I'm going to specifically talk about some of the fictionalized stories that have been told throughout history that have these undertones of this Gnostic messianic bloodline that they're trying to protect through fictional history. We're also going to talk about the finding of the supposed tomb of Jesus and his family members. And then we will talk about the Rh negative connection of this supposed bloodline of Jesus and how that's ramping up in this day and age, and why that these ideas might be ramping up more so than they were over the past 30, 40 years. Because again, this isn't a new concept, but it's come back around again. And it's something I wanted to talk about and go into it very thoroughly. And hopefully 4 parts is going to be thorough enough for people. And I'm sure there's some people out there that are like, I'm tired of you talking about this. Well, it's like I always say, it's my show and I'm going to talk about what I want to. And I find this super fascinating and interesting. And I do think it needs to be talked about, just like some of these other ideas that are resurfacing that are becoming staples within this truther or conspiratorial space, where people are latching onto these ideas again, and they're actually evolving. They're actually turning into bigger things. And I think that was always the purpose when they were started. I think you start planting the seeds, pun intended, with plant hard, planting his Priory of Sion seeds, and then it culminating in the future with what I think is going to be this Antichrist bloodline that's presented to us as being part of this messianic bloodline of the actual Jesus Christ, which in actuality, it won't be from that bloodline. It'll be from a different, albeit supernatural bloodline or lines that are intermingled together, which we will talk specifically about today. And obviously, when we go into the episode next week, when we're talking about RH negative, we'll get to that too. But I want to start with Joseph of Arimathea, and we're actually going to read scripture first, so we get the scriptural representation of Joseph of Arimathea, and then we'll start talking about who the Gnostics think he was, who he actually was, why is he connected to James the Just. We'll get into that a little bit before we get into Scoda and then the Merovingians, which I think is important because Joseph of Arimathea finds himself intermingled with both of those groups. Hey guys, I just want to let you know about the new film, The Meadow Project, we have coming out on July 27th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our team signed NDAs to join another team, ASOG, who has done research into a mysterious meadow where high strangeness exists. We had some very supernatural experiences out there that we documented, and we can't wait to let you see all of it. Join us for the live premiere at moment.co/The Meadow Project for the premiere, as well as the live Q&A after the film. Also, Free the Rabbits merch is up and running at freetherabbits.myshopify.com, including the Touch the Grass t-shirt, Nephilim Portal Babies tee, Free the Rabbits logo tee, and Free the Rabbits logo trucker style hats. All of the tees are soft tees with several color options to choose from. Don't forget to join our memberships here on YouTube with 3 different tiers, all which come with custom emojis. Again, I appreciate all of you for being here. Now, let's get back into the show. So we'll start with Matthew 27, verse 57. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. So Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut into the rock. Then he rolled a great stone across the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. So this is where we get the biblical connection of Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea, who drops Jesus off in this tomb. And by all accounts, he owned the tomb. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb watching this. Go to Mark 15:42. Now it was already evening, since it was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member. From that verbiage, most scholars think that he was a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, and that he was later ousted from the Sanhedrin. And there's other documents that talk about that, and we'll definitely touch on that today. But it says a prominent council member who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. So he actually followed Jesus. So he differed some from a lot of his other Jewish counterparts in that he believed that Jesus was the Son of God according to the scriptures. Obviously, according to Gnostic scripture, he did not believe that. He thought Jesus was just a great prophet, and he tricked the Romans by faking that Jesus had died, and they actually pulled him off the cross and got him to safety and revitalized him. And that's when he started this messianic bloodline with Mary Magdalene. And this is Joseph of Arimathea back in Mark 15 talking to Pilate. And this was the conversation of the Gnostics talking about Jesus wasn't up on the cross very long. The scriptures actually confer that. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. So he summoned the centurion to ask if this was so. When Pilate had confirmed it with the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. So the thought pattern with the Gnostics is the reason why that Jesus wasn't up on the cross that long is because of Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus's followers. They helped fake the death, the early death, so they could get him off the cross. And apparently it was confirmed to the centurion. So the centurion was either paid off or he's part of the process to let Pilate know that he was dead when he wasn't dead. Again, this isn't scriptural. This is just in Gnostic doctrine. So Joseph bought a linen cloth, took down the body of Jesus, wrapped it in the cloth, and placed it in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where his body was placed. Now we go to Luke 23. Now, there was a council member named Joseph, a good and righteous man, who had not consented to their decision or action. He was from the Judean town of Arimathea and was waiting for the kingdom of God. He went to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut into the rock where no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was beginning. Go to John 19. Afterward, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. So thought pattern ends, like I said earlier, he was part of the Sanhedrin and secretly followed Jesus, but also had a pretty high standing in the community. So it's kind of what I've always suggested, just because evil always finds a way to infiltrate or become double agents or CIA and manipulate the masses. I always believe there's a opposite effect going on too, where you've got good people who are also double agents in positions where that they can actually make a difference. So that's why I always say that while we're so consumed with evil taking us down and we're always worried about what the puppet masters or puppeteering, we also have to understand there's a opposite side to this. It's actually greater and stronger. So that's why we shouldn't be living in fear because of this particular reason. I believe that there are people in power that are actually working on the side of good. And that's why there's a lot of disruptions that happen within the government where they can't always get things to happen the way they want. I think what happened in 2020 is a prime example. I think they wanted to push that further than they were able to do. And I think there were a lot of people that were very aware of what was going on, but I also think there were people in power that were pushing back. It's just not that everyone in power or every celebrity or every person in some sort of high standing is evil or manipulated. We got to get out of that mindset. And I've been saying that since day one on the show. And I believe this is a good example right here, a biblical example of a guy who was working in very high standing within the government. He knew Pontius Pilate personally, but yet he was also working with Jesus and what he knew that was the ultimate plan, and he was helping that plan along. So in John 19, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate to let him remove the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had previously come to Jesus at night, also brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. So they took the body of Jesus and wrapped it in linen cloths with spices according to the Jewish burial custom. There was a garden in the place where Jesus was crucified, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, the tomb was nearby, they placed Jesus there. So these are the four Gospels talking about Joseph of Arimathea. So he is talked about specifically in Scripture. So we know that he existed. We know that he was essentially part of the Sanhedrin. We know that he was in high standing with the government, and we also know that he was very close to Jesus. So these things we do know. So this is kind of when the enemy comes in and twists it, right? We get these Gnostic doctrines talking about who Joseph of Arimathea actually was. So we got to talk about how did the British and Scottish kingships owe their intrigue and secretive inheritance to the legends surrounding Joseph of Arimathea, and how is Joseph of Arimathea tied into the Essenes, the Merovingians, the secret bloodlines, all of these things, because he's very important to this Gnostic lore, and he is the one that essentially sparks this messianic line by the actions that he takes. Now, we talked about Lawrence Garner before, but just to get a quick refresher, he was a British author and lecturer, and he wrote specifically about religious speculation like the bloodline of Jesus. And he notes, and he's also a Rex Deus chronologist. So he was writing out the chronology of these Davidic Jesus bloodlines, and he ties it into the Celtic kings that claim their legendary origins came from the bloodlines of Jesus. And this ties directly into Celtic Christianity. And by the way, Garner's book, I know we talked about this already, was The Bloodline of the Holy Grail, and that was published in 1996. And it was pushed very hard when it came out, but he talks a lot about how those bloodlines are tied into descendants like King Arthur and the House of Stuart, which we talked about the House of Stuart. And he also talked about other things as well. He definitely was into alchemy, and he theorized about Freemasonry a lot. One of the really interesting things, he wrote a book, The Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark, in which he talks about the Ark of the Covenant was a machine for manufacturing gold, which was a supposed elixir which could be used to extend life. So this is definitely right down an alchemist rabbit hole for sure. So he had a way of tying a lot of Gnostic ideas and a lot of alchemy in together, which you'll see throughout history. And Gardner also claimed he himself was descended from the House of Stuart, which was also descended of Jesus Christ. So Gardner was very invested in these ideas of the Priory of Sion and the Merovingian bloodlines and the House of Stuart, because he had tracked his bloodlines back, and he was, from his account, of the bloodlines of Jesus, which goes back to, hey, let me figure out a way that I'm extra special and no one else isn't. So to get to Celtic Christianity, which Gardner ties into these messianic bloodlines, it was a form of Christianity that was common, or held to be common, across Celtic-speaking world during the early Middle Ages. The term Celtic Church is said by many historians, it was a unified and identifiable entity entirely separate from the mainstream Western Christendom. And this is where the idea that the Celtic Church and the Roman Catholic Church were at complete odds. But what's interesting is a lot of the major players that are connected within the Celtic Christian Church are also major players within the Roman Catholic Church. It goes right back to what I've been saying since this series started, that the major players had their hands in both, that this Gnostic Christianity was intertwined all within the Roman Catholic Church as well. It wasn't just the Roman Catholic Church were wiping out these Gnostics for no reason. The ideologies weren't what they were trying to take out. On the surface, yeah, that's exactly what it looked like. They were against these doctrines, and there were people obviously involved that were against these doctrines that were looking at it specifically from that point of view. I'm talking about the puppet masters behind the scenes. They're playing both ends of it, but they all agreed on the same thing. And the Celtic Church did not accept the doctrines of the virgin birth, the resurrection, or the divinity of Christ. So again, on the surface, they would be at odds with the Roman Catholic Church. But when you look at their symbiotic relationship historically, they were working together. And Celtic Christianity was Druidism and Gnosticism all mixed together, and it was all hidden under this Christian ideology, very much like the Roman Catholic Church hides behind a Christian ideology, which some of it is perfectly fine. And I believe that there are people who are Catholics who are completely Christian. Again, we're talking about the puppet masters behind the scenes trying to manipulate. And this kind of reminds me of what we talked about in the last episode with the Templars and the Muslim assassins. They had this front of Christianity and Islam, but behind the scenes, it was all about this Gnostic doctrine that they both believed in. And it's very similar to what we talked about with St. Bernard when he integrated the Scottish Celtic Church into Cistercian Gnostic order, which is very similar. How we slide this whole Gnostic idea, intertwine it in and hide it within the Roman Catholic Church, or just Christianity in general. And the Cistercians, for those that don't know, official order of Cistercians was a Catholic religious order of monks and nuns that branched off from the Benedictines and followed the rule of Saint Benedict, as well as the contributions of the highly influential Bernard of Clairvaux, or Saint Bernard, known as the Latin Rule. And the Latin Rule is the document with 72 clauses attributed to St. Bernard and Hugh de Pans, two of the guys who started the Templar order, and the Latin rule or the 72 clauses is known as the specific behavior for the Templar order. And this was all added in at the Council of Troyes, which we talked about in the last episode. So yes, this Cistercian order, which was hidden within Roman Catholicism, was a Templar Gnostic order, specifically under the Latin rule. So again, more proof that Roman Catholicism and Gnosticism were not opposed behind the scenes. They're actually all working in tandem to hide these bloodlines, to essentially rule the world. What they're trying to do now is the same thing. They've been trying to do it forever. And this is how they do it. They create on the surface a facade of 2, 3, 4, 5 entities fighting each other. But behind the scenes, they actually all believe the same thing, at least at the top. And it's just a manipulation from those said entities. And it makes everyone else who's not privy to this information to think that, again, on the surface, that these two religious groups are fighting over religion, when in actuality, they believe the exact same thing, at least at the top. And to Celtic Christianity, one of the most famous of the Celtic Christian kings is King Arthur. And Arthur is tied in so much to Holy Grail, Messianic line lore, and he's considered a legend, or in some scholars' minds, as a mythological figure. However, there are tons of Welsh sources that specifically talk about this king, that he was a leader of the post-Roman Britons in battles against Anglo-Saxons in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. He actually appears in two early medieval historical sources, the Annales of Cambria and Historia Brittonum, but detractors will say that these date 300 years after he is supposed to have lived, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the stories are false. They could have been writings from other works that we are not privy to. And I think there are a lot of documents and works that have been hidden from us over the years that would give us a deeper clue into a lot of these very controversial and quote unquote mythological people who are actually real, which I think that King Arthur was real. And he was said to be a king of Britain, and who also defeated the Saxons and established this massive empire. And there were so many mythological elements that were added in later or were recovered. And some of these are his father being Uther Pendragon, and the magician Merlin working with him, and his wife Guinevere, the sword Excalibur. We can go down the line, and we know that 12th century French writers were talking about Lancelot and the Holy Grail, and they begin to add in this Arthurian romance to the entire thing. But the Arthurian romance is actually said to have been implemented as a fictionalized version of what would be considered the messianic bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And a lot of these were hidden throughout stories, which we will talk about for sure on the next episode. And we'll talk about how some of these fictional tales that have been brought down throughout history were actually this legomenism that's hidden within them. And we've been talking about legomenism since the first episode. And this hidden verbiage that only the initiates would be able to see are hidden throughout all of these fictionalized stories, and King Arthur would be no different. Now, I do think King Arthur was more than likely real, and I think a lot of the fictionalized parts of the story could have its basis in some reality, right? If we're talking about these Nephilim and these fairy bloodlines like the Tuatha De Danann, which we'll talk about today too, all of this stuff is intermingled, and it would make sense that King Arthur, who is said to have come from this messianic line, that there was some version of it rooted in reality. And to the point of all of the Priory of Sion lore, it said that the Arthur and Grail legends were commissioned by the Priory of Sion families, and that's according to Templar historians. And they say it's most likely that Grail and other Rex Deus literature of the 12th century forward was anchored in what they call troubadour poetry, which was invented by the Gnostic Cathars. And we've talked about the Cathars a lot on this show, but a troubadour was a composer and performer of old lyric poetry during the High Middle Ages. And this particularly came out of Occitania, and that was a region of southern France. And this is where the Cathar religious movement came from. So the troubadours, which were these lyric poets, would intertwine all of this Gnostic imagery into the poetry that they put out. And most of their songs deal with themes of chivalry, courtly love. A lot of them were metaphysical, shocker, intellectual, and formulaic, which means that people would be able to sing along with them very easily. And they mixed a lot of humor and satire in it, which also lends the idea that there's a lot of truth in humor. So these guys would be putting out their truth, these Cathars, these Gnostic Cathars were these troubadours, and they were very integral in getting out the Holy Grail ideas through this type of entertainment. And really when the troubadours became really big was when the returning crusaders like Richard Lionheart, who's also tied into the tales of Robin Hood, which I'm going to talk specifically about on next episode, and which is an actual hidden tale of the messianic bloodlines of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But the troubadours were big in putting that out. And one of their biggest symbols for the troubadours was the rose. And we talk about how the rose is tied into Rosicrucianism, it's tied into the Priory of Sion, and ultimately represents the Grail, which is Mary Magdalene. So it's interesting that the troubadour's symbol was this rose, which the rose ties all the way back to this Gnostic idea of Mary Magdalene being the chalice of Jesus to create this bloodline. And another thing that the troubadours were big about doing is the type of poetry that they pushed was this European lyrical literature with its emphasis on exalting women to saintly status, which they connected even to Isis. And also, and this is according to Dan Brown, which we've talked about a lot on this show, he said the troubadours were in fact servants of the Church of Mary Magdalene, and that they sang renditions of songs due to the virtue of Our Lady, and it was a mysterious, beautiful woman they pledged their allegiance to. So if we think about it, these troubadours were essentially worshiping Mary Magdalene, who was supposedly the wife of Jesus. So this is all connected within their songs that have tons of Rex Deus influence and Grail bloodline influence as well. And this brings us right back into Joseph of Arimathea, who Gnostic legends say was a disciple of Jesus. Well, actually, scripture also says that. So this is one of those things that, hey, they both got right. Matter of fact, the Gnostics get a lot right when it comes to things that are biblically historical, but then you'll see that twist and all of a sudden that road ends up way over there. And that's what they're really good at doing, the sleight of hand, where they'll show you this truth and you're all wrapped in, and then all of a sudden they just start dropping all of these falsities. Before you know it, you're running down this road of Gnosticism that is not based in anything outside of their particular writers that write it. And in other writings, Joseph is additionally known to be a wealthy merchant and a noble senator with a degree of power within the Jerusalem community, which we read within the first four Gospels. We can gather that, right? But there's all kinds of other extracurricular texts out there that confer with this. But obviously the Gnostics take it a bit further with what they said that he was. So we know that Joseph was a member of the Jewish elders, more than likely the Sanhedrin. And these are also a group of the same people who sentenced Jesus to death. So we have to really think about that he was a part of the group, not saying that he was there. Clearly, he wasn't a part of the group that was condemning him, but he was a part of this group. Also, there are other non-biblical sources that suggest that Joseph slash James. I put James in there because this is this Gnostic idea that Joseph of Arimathea was also James, brother of Jesus. And they tout him as a master craftsman like his father and a artificer of metals, which ties us back into Tubal-Cain, who was a master builder, who added Cain to his name because he wanted to connect himself to the original Cain, which was the original master builder. So this ties right back into Freemasonry too. So this is this Gnostic idea that Joseph of Arimathea was also this master craftsman. He was the master of the craft. So take what you will from that, which I find super interesting. And this comes straight out of not only Gnostic literature, but also theosophical literature too, and Rex Deus literature that create this James, the brother of Jesus, as the true apostolic successor of Jesus, and how that he started the Essenes and how the Essenes were original Christianity, that Judaism and Pauline Christianity were the two that were fighting, but they weren't the original, which is funny because when you track it back historically, the Gnostic Essenes were a weird offshoot of Judaism, which honestly, if you think about it, Judaism was long before Jesus even came around. That is the law, right? Christian Judaism is them accepting Jesus was the Messiah. And that was when you had the Judaic Christians, and then you had the Pauline Christians, which are the Gentiles. And with Paul Peter, the real James, Jesus' brother, not the fake James, who they say is Jesus' brother, but it's actually Joseph of Arimathea because he changed his name, became this whole thing, that they were actually working together. We see that in scripture. I've already read that, I believe, in episode 1, where they were working together, but the Gnostics try to act like that the Essenes were the original Christianity. Jesus wasn't divine. He was just a man. He was a prophet, great prophet, and he had children with Mary Magdalene, and this is what they're protecting because the Gnostics want to claim that they were this fundamental faction, the foundational faction guiding early Christianity, but the two competing factions were Judaic Christianity and Pauline Christianity, and they were fighting it out. But what's also funny is too, that there are definite places in history where the Gnostics had an advantage over Roman Catholicism in certain areas, and they took them out. It wasn't because they were getting chased out. It's because they were also doing what the Roman Catholics are doing. But in the end, they just didn't have the numbers that the Roman Catholics did. It didn't mean that both sides weren't doing things that were not right, because I don't think that Roman Catholicism is a great structure for Christianity at all. I think it was implemented as a form of control. I don't think the early part of it was, because that was before it was even called Roman Catholicism. And I don't even consider that Roman Catholicism, even though some people want to say that it is. That didn't come along until later. But I think the structure came in to control people. And then you had these Gnostic groups who are opposed to that. And then now when you look at it historically, you say, well, the Gnostics had to be right because they were getting wiped out. No, they were just the weaker of the two. They both were not doing what they were supposed to do. They both were wrong, essentially. So I think we got to start looking at things even with deeper layers than just as cut and dry. And it goes back to what I said in the last episode, that why don't we look at the ancient past just like we look at modern day wars, where we've got puppeteers puppeting puppets. They just use religion more back then than they do now. That's the only difference. And I think one thing that the Gnostics can point to scripturally is that James, the brother of Jesus, didn't even believe that Jesus was God up until Jesus died, which is talked about in scripture. Now, we'll look at one of the scriptures that I've looked at before, because we're going to just talk about what scripture says exactly about James, because we already talked about Joseph of Arimathea, and we know that these Gnostic groups blend the two together and say they're one, but scripture specifically talks about them being absolutely different. So Matthew 13:55, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? So there's James right there as one of the brothers of Jesus. Mark 6:3, isn't this the carpenter's son, the son of Mary and the and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. Aren't his sisters here with us as well? And they took offense at him. Jesus did have sisters. This was that verse I was telling you about, I believe, in episode 1, where I said it's alluded to him having sisters. We just don't know any of their names. And scripture also, and I just said this, records James and his siblings were skeptics of Jesus. But by the time of the resurrection, it's concluded that James was converted as one of Jesus' disciples. And we know this from 1 Corinthians 15, 5-7, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one of untimely birth, and to the point of James not believing and Jesus was who he was. We find this in John 7, 2-5. However, the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near, so Jesus' brothers said to him, leave him here to go to Judea so that your disciples there may see the works you're doing. For no one who wants to be known publicly acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world. So this is the brothers, this is his family saying, show yourself if you are who you say you are. For even his own brothers did not believe him. This is scriptural, so they didn't even believe who he was until later. And we also know from Paul that after Jesus left this earth, that James was one of his disciples, one of his apostles that helped push the Judaic Christianity sect and worked in tandem with Paul. We know this from Galatians 1:19. And Paul says, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So we knew for a fact that Paul knew who James was and James knew who Paul was. They weren't working opposite each other. James or slash Joseph of Arimathea wasn't running around with the Essenes, and they were the real Christian group. And then Paul and James and Peter weren't working together. They were all working in tandem. They were all doing what they were told to by God. And I find it funny how Gnostics love twisting that out of proportion. There's nothing scripturally suggests that Joseph of Arimathea and James, brother of Jesus, are even the same person. As a matter of fact, and we talked about Eusebius back on episode 1, and even he quotes Clement of Alexandria in his writings, and he says that Peter, James, and John chose James to be the first bishop of Jerusalem after the ascension of Jesus. So we know that Eusebius, who was a major writer of early Christian histories, talks about that James was chosen by Paul and Peter to become the first bishop of Jerusalem or the leader of Judaic Christianity. And we can even tie that into the book of Acts in the Bible. We go to Acts 21:18-19, and this is where James appears to be the church leader at that point. And the verse says, when we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. So he's there with the elders. So we know that James is running this Judaic Christianity. He's not an Essene. He is a part of the early church, but the Essenes were not a part of this early church like that. They were, again, this underground, weird, Gnostic offshoot that claims that they have the real truth. Eusebius also suggests that James had a surname of the just by the ancients. And the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas also talks about James's title being just. So this lends to the overlap, because you got these Christian historians who say that James went by the just, and the Gnostics like, oh yeah, he was the just, but he's also Joseph of Arimathea. Even Josephus, who wrote Antiquities of the Jews, and I talk about plenty of times on this show, he talks about James being a just and pious Jew, and he also denotes him as being the just as well. And he talks about that James was brought before the Sadducee high priest of Judah, and before the Sanhedrin judges. So obviously, James is not Joseph of Arimathea, because he's being brought before the Sanhedrin, and he was a part of the Sanhedrin, according to what it looks like in scripture and what some of the extra canonical sources out there say. So it's a weird overlap, right? Now, I guess the Gnostics would argue that, yeah, well, he turned on them and they got mad at him, but this doesn't necessarily work for much of their literature, because according to Josephus, James was sentenced to be stoned, and he died in 62 AD, and that's by most accounts. So Josephus didn't record James's death, but only that he was sentenced to die of stoning. So the Gnostics like to use this, and that's at the heart of Theosophist lore and Gnostic lore. And this is when James / Joseph of Arimathea escaped to Jerusalem. And this is when he changed his name to Joseph of Arimathea so he could hide in secret. So it's so convoluted when you really dig through it, and it doesn't match up to scripture at all. But if we look further into, did James die? Was he put to death by the Sanhedrin? Then yes, we can look to church records, and they record the death of James. And because they say that he is recorded as dead, this nullifies this alleged survival and escape from James to Jerusalem, becoming Joseph of Arimathea. Matter of fact, the book of Acts records the final meeting between James and Paul that took place in the late 50 AD, and that places James still in Jerusalem during the time that the Gnostics would have said James had already escaped and James was now Joseph of Arimathea, which is funny because Gnostic lore is so all over the place. There's even parts of Gnosticism that talk about that he was in England, and these are according to the Grail legends. So Joseph of Arimathea was bouncing around a lot in these Gnostic texts, and you have to look through all of them and see that, hey, even their texts don't really match up specifically. Now, we know he escaped from Jerusalem. We know that he heads to England from all accounts, but again, he was still in Jerusalem at this particular time. So he hasn't escaped yet. He hasn't left. We're going to go pull from Hegesippus, which I talked about on the first episode, to another early Christian writer and scholar. He recorded that James was martyred, being stoned to death and then thrown from the top of the temple. So we've got multiple early Christian sources that talk about James was stoned and was killed, so he could not have left Jerusalem and ended up in England or wherever else that the Gnostics say that he ended up right after, right? Some say he hid deeper in Jerusalem. Some say he ran and left. He went to England. So we've got all of these different ideas about what he was actually doing, and this is when he changed his moniker to Joseph of Arimathea. And you may ask, why is James being connected to Joseph of Arimathea? Well, this comes from the Gnostic idea, and this comes straight out of the Essene community, that the Joseph was a title, that it meant the second born of the dynastic succession, which was secondary to Jesus holding the Judaic and dynastic Essene title of David, or Davidum. So you've got the Davidum, which is the number one, and then the number two, which would be James, which would be the second brother after Jesus. He would have held the title of Joseph. So this is why that he was known in the Essene community as Joseph of Arimathea. The phonetic translation is Joseph of Arimathea. So we may ask, well, who was this mysterious Gnostic Joseph of Arimathea? He wouldn't have been the Joseph of Arimathea in the Bible, and he wouldn't have been James, who was the brother of Jesus. Well, there likely probably was a Joseph who may have even masqueraded as Joseph of Arimathea, and he was this non-biblical Joseph of Grail lore, and he probably did flee to England from Peter and Pauline Christianity because clearly he was a part of this Gnostic offshoot that people weren't accepting at the time. And he left to do what these occult organizations do. They move to another place, they operate in clandestine secrecy, and they create all of these falsities that they trickle out throughout history and then cultivate them as truths later on, which is happening right now. We're seeing it again, that the bloodlines of Jesus is ramping up. It's being put back in people's faces again, like it's an actual reality. And to some of these Gnostic legends, they say that before the crucifixion, that because Joseph of Arimathea, and this is Gnostic lore, that this Joseph of Arimathea was actually James, used his friendship with Pilate and influence on the Jewish elder council to broker a deal to the Jesus problem. So he was playing them by saying that they were going to kill Jesus, and in actuality, they pulled Jesus off the cross before he died, and then they created this bloodline of Jesus with Mary Magdalene, which Jesus, and I talked about the last episode, ended up re-meeting with Mary Magdalene in France. And this was after he was healed and put back together from being hung on the cross. And if you think about it, if we take on board that this actually happened, right, that Jesus didn't die and he came off the cross and he created this bloodline, and this is what these secret societies are hiding, this secret bloodline of Jesus. Well, if we're looking at the future Antichrist or whatever they're trying to create in that vein, it would make sense that he would come from this messianic line of Jesus. Then they would be able to push that when he comes forward. And I think it's very high likelihood that that could happen. Then all of this old information that was said to not be true, the prior Sion records that Pierre Plantard put out, they could resurface as, oh, well, actually he was being silenced by the church, very classic Gnostic sleight of hand. And they'll use that to perpetuate this idea of Christ consciousness and that anyone can become a Christ, but he comes from this line of an actual Christ, and they're going to be able to use that. And I think it's something we have to think about when we're thinking about end times and we're thinking about who the Antichrist could be and what he would perpetrate for people to see. And then we have to think deeper, like what is the bloodline that he's actually carrying that gives him some sort of power? Yeah, the idea of coming from a messianic bloodline of Jesus is great on the forefront, that you push to people and say, this is why I deserve power, which a lot of these kingships did do. We're about to talk about the Irish kings and the tribe of Scota here in a second, and the Merovingians, and that's why they were able to just have this authority when they walked in. Well, this is what's going to give this Antichrist this authority, this, at least to the Abrahamic religions, the people that follow those, which covers most of the world when you look at it in some format, right? So if you push that and you say that, well, this guy is from the Davidic line, he's from Jesus Christ, and he is the new Messiah, the new Christ. He's the ultimate evolution of Christ consciousness. And he's going to teach us all how to reach that level. And that could be mixed in with transhumanism. It could be mixed in with something that people take to enhance their DNA. All these different things we have to look at when we're talking about technology now. We can't, sidestep that part of it, the technology piece. But I do think that that is probably at least going to be a part of what they showcase to disrupt the religions around the world. So we're going to start looking at these Irish kings, these Scottish kings, and why they link their history back to the Irish through the tribe of Scota. So we got to find out who Scota is. And there's two different versions of Scota, and we'll talk about that and why that one in particular looks to be more of where these bloodlines come from. And they do come from the Israelites, which is very interesting. When we start talking about the lost tribes of Israel, this is where a lot of this lore and this Grail lore comes from too. Now, in medieval Irish and Scottish legends, Scota is the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh and ancestor of the Gaels. She is said to be the origin of their Latin name Scoti, but modern historians say she and her alleged ancestors and spouses were purely mythological and were created to explain the name and to fit the Gaels into historical narrative, of course, because how could anything people wrote in the past be true? It was all made up. It's very classic with the modern historian too. And they're quick to discount all of these writings and genealogies when it doesn't fit what they're trying to push. And we're going to talk about the Stone of Scone or the Stone of Destiny a little bit here too. We kind of have to when we're talking about Scota. And there are some historians that would probably be considered outside of the mainstream, but they have talked about the ascension of the Scottish ancestry, these kings, and that's tied into Scota and her being the transporter of the Stone of Scone from ancient Egypt during the exodus of Moses to Scotland. And in 1296, the stone was captured by Edward I of England and taken to Westminster Abbey. And in 1323, Robert the Bruce, which you've talked about plenty on these episodes, of the bloodlines of Jesus, according to some of these historians that are outside the mainstream, have connected him to the Scoda stone in an attempt to return it to Scone Abbey in Scotland. Very interesting stuff. What is it about this stone that is not in England anymore? As a matter of fact, it is currently back at Edinburgh Castle. But interestingly enough, the coronation of King Charles, they brought the stone back for his coronation. Very interesting. They brought it to England to crown King Charles as the new king. And why would they bring this stone of destiny to England to coronate King Charles, who is of what bloodlines? We have to ask the question, why would they need this stone there? And we're going to get into that in just a second, but I do want to jump back into Scoda's legendary beginnings. And it originates with her marriage to a mysterious person who is thought to be of Israeli descent. Now, Scoda's believed to be the daughter of the famous Akhenaten, and he was the pharaoh who was also known as Amenhotep IV. And he is noted for abandoning traditional ancient Egyptian religion of polytheism and introducing Atonism, or worship centered around Aten. And that's interesting because his tie-ins are that some people think that he was the pharaoh that did essentially war with Moses. And he was the one that eventually let the Israelites go because he and Moses were butting heads. And we know the story of the plagues. And he was supposedly the king of that. And when Moses left, that was why he changed the religion to monotheism, because of Moses believing in one God. So now he decided that he would change the entire structure of religion in Egypt to also believe in one God. There's also a whole tie-in. The Hoteps talk about this a lot, and there are other Gnostic groups that talk about that Moses himself was Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten. I don't believe that in the slightest. I think if we just look at it specifically, we can surmise that they're not the same people. Now, I would say that there's a way that we can look at that Akhenaten was the pharaoh over Moses at the time. Now, I can get down with that line of thinking, but as far as him being actual Moses, I don't buy. And Akhenaten had 6 daughters and 1 son through his wife Nefertiti, and one of those daughters was Scota, and she married a man named Mills Espane in Rex Deus Legends. And if we look up Irish myths of Mill Espane, he's the mythical ancestor of the final inhabitants of Ireland. The sons of Mill are the Milesians, who represent the vast majority of the Irish Gaels. His father was Baal, son of Bregan. Modern historians believe he is a creation of medieval Irish Christian writers. So again, back to he's not real, but there's tons of writings of who he was. And this interesting connection between this Israelite connection that ties directly into Ireland and Scotland. And maybe that's why they try to keep some of this stuff hidden. So Mills Espane, according to these writings, he was a royal Scythian, and his people were some form of Israelite descent. Scota and Mills Espane bore a son in Egypt named Goidel, and he's also known as Gadiel or Gael. So this is where they get the idea of the Gaels, is their son was called Gael, and this is what started this massive group of people that were in Ireland. And the Gaels are an insular Celtic group native to Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. They're also associated with Gaelic languages, a branch of Celtic languages comprising of Irish, Manx, and Scottish Gaelic. And in the Middle Ages, and this is during that period of time where all of these bloodlines are ruling, they are controlling things behind the scenes, and this Gaelic culture became so dominant throughout the rest of Scotland and the Isle of Man. There was also some Gaelic settlement in Wales as well. And even during the Viking Age, Vikings raided and settled in the Gaelic lands, and they became what they call the Norse Gaels. So the Gaels were intertwined within everything. And this ties back into that Celtic Christianity, that Gnosticism. And this is the idea of Scota with Mills Essene, with their son Grail, which created these Gaels and even the Gaelic language as well. Now, depending on which historical literature you look at, Scota and her husband, they either knew Moses and the Israelites or were a lost tribe from the Exodus in some traditions. But whatever, they were forced to flee Egypt at the same time as the Exodus because of their monotheistic belief in Aten. In fact, they were noted to have fled in fear and terror from the old gods of Egypt that Akhenaten had previously suppressed. So we know that they were monotheistic family, and this does tie directly into Gnosticism, which generally, I don't know, Gnosticism is such a weird conglomeration of a lot of different things. But if we're talking about the early beginnings of Gnostic ideology, they do believe in a central monad, and all these other gods trickle out from that. However, depending, again, on what Gnostic literature you look at, Sophia is looked at as the equal to the monad. So you've got this divine feminine, which is the equal to that. So we're talking about the two different Scotas. So in one story, we've got Scoda and Mills Essene fled to Egypt from Scythia, then Africa, before settling in Spain. And they were known in this particular legend as the Milesians. In another version, though, a Milesian descendant, Brogan, later traveled to Egypt, fought the Ethiopians, and married Scota, daughter of Pharaoh. So this is how we get to these two different versions of who Scota was. In one version, Scota's with Mills Essene, and they flee to Egypt. In this other version, we've got Brogan, who goes to Egypt, fights the Ethiopians, and takes Scota. But the difference between these two legends is the time between when Scota left Egypt and went to Spain, and then went from Spain to Ireland, and it spans about 800 years. So when historians look at it, they say, well, there was probably two Scotas. So you've got two, and generally speaking, the second Scota is the one that's connected to Mills Essene, and this is the one that's interwoven through the Milesian descendants, through Brogan, who comes along later, which begot the Irish kingdoms. And through this is when this stone of Akhenaten, or the Bethel stone, which is also called the stone of Scota, and the Bethel stone is supposedly when Jacob laid his head on the stone and then he wrestled with God later. This stone is tied into so much lore and mystery. And I'm not going to do this episode about the Stone of Scone or the Stone of Destiny today. I'm just showing its importance and how it shows up with Scota and essentially Mills Essene when they end up in Ireland. And interestingly enough, in these legendary stories of these Irish kings who modern historians say didn't exist, we've got a story of Eber Finn, and Eber Finn was one of the sons of Mills Essene. And according to Irish legend and historical tradition, he was the High King of Ireland, one of the founders of the Milesian lineage. And this is what genealogists traced to the important Gaelic royal lines. So again, Mills Essene had several sons with Scota, and this was one of them. Now, during this battle, when they go to Ireland to take over Ireland, there were three kings. There was Mac Cool, Mac Ket, and Mac Gran of the Tuatha De Danann, which I'm going to talk about specifically here. They actually kill 5 of the 7 sons, and when the 7 sons try to leave, this is how 5 of them die, they try to leave after the battle's not working out in their favor. They set sail, but this Tuatha De Danann brew up this magical storm, which drowns 5 of the sons. But then Eber Finn comes back with his brothers, and they actually take out these Tuatha De Danann. And if you don't know who the Tuatha De Danann are, its meaning is the folk of the goddess Danu, also known by earlier name Tuatha De, tribe of the gods, and they're a supernatural race in Irish mythology. They're often depicted as kings, queens, druids, bards, warriors, heroes, healers, and craftsmen who have supernatural powers. They dwell in the other world, but interact with humans in the human world. So they're able to move in and out between realities. And this really lends to the idea that the Tuatha De Danann were one of several things, right? We know they come from, at least what spawns from them is fairies, which we'll talk about in a second too. But according to, depending on who you talk to, they were either fallen angels or they were Nephilim, which, because of their size and what they look like in mythologies, they were looked at as more than likely, in my opinion, of Nephilim origin, which makes a lot of sense here in a second. We're talking about bloodlines being mixed in Ireland. So the Picts, who were a group of people that is now Scotland north of the Firth of Forth in the early Middle Ages, are said to be a derivative from these Tuatha De Danann, and they're said to come from these fairies. So this is another bloodline that is intertwined in Ireland and essentially Scotland. And this is where these Davidic bloodlines, these lost tribes, were also at with these Nephilim bloodlines. So now we're starting to get an even clearer picture of the intermingling and what was actually being hidden. What is actually supposed messianic bloodline of Jesus? Was it actually Jesus, or was it something even crazier when we're looking at the fact that there were these Nephilim bloodlines all over this area of the place where these lines of Scoda came out of, and essentially the Merovingian bloodlines also came out of. And these Irish bloodlines of Scoda, they actually eventually migrated to Scotland, and as a part of that, they also brought the Bethel stone with them, and they united the Scots with the Picts. So more uniting of different bloodlines, different sects of people. And it basically brought together two separate bloodlines. And the Picts, who were part of this fairy bloodline, and this is also in Theosophy, where they talk about they're one of the three branches of the Tuatha De Danann. And the fact that they brought this Stone of Destiny with them, and it was supposedly a stone of Akhenaten's throne, and it's said to be the throne, a piece of the throne of David as well, at least in theory. And this is what the Gnostics push when they have this stone there, and they have to commemorate their kings with this stone. But I find it funny that they brought it to England just specifically for King Charles here, and it makes you really wonder what bloodlines he's actually a part of. So because of this union of Scoda and Mills Essene, this is where the Irish hold that they were Israelite descendants through the immigration of the Israelites from the Exodus of Egypt. And there are other Israelite bloodlines that all tie into this Irish lore too, but this is the main one that really brings this Stone of Destiny there and this Davidic bloodline that had to be there. And this is where that if we get into the speculative part of it, because we're looking at the idea of the Tuatha De Danann, we're looking at the offshoots like the Picts, all of them already there. And then you've got Mills Essene and his sons who come in with Scoda and fight them and take them over, and then intermingling with them. Well, now you've got these Nephilim bloodlines that are all intermingled into what they consider to be the messianic bloodline of Jesus, which now we're really starting to unveil what these bloodlines actually are, and that this messianic bloodline is covering it up by saying that, oh no, this is the bloodline of Jesus, when in actuality, it's the bloodline of these Nephilim. And another portion of this, a very big portion, is the Merovingians. And we've heard tons about the Merovingians when it comes to these bloodlines, these messianic bloodlines. And the Merovingians actually celebrate that their royal bloodlines are the marriage of the Davidic / Jesus dynasty with another branch of royal Israelite blood, which is connected them to Saul of the Benjamites. And if you haven't, make sure you go back and listen to Saul, King of the Nephilim. episode, or listen to some of my good Nephilim episodes, specifically episode 4, where I also get into the Benjamites who were intermingled with the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites came from the Amorites, which were giants. So the Benjamites are known to have this Nephilim bloodline origin. So we're already getting this idea from the Merovingians that they're saying that the messianic bloodline of Jesus is intermingled in with this Nephilim bloodline of Saul. So that's fascinating enough on itself, because if we're tracking that Benjamite bloodline all the way back to the intermingling with these Nephilim bloodlines, well, then you're actually saying that this messianic bloodline is intermingled in with this Nephilim bloodline, which in actuality, if you really want to look at it as deeply as possible, it's just Nephilim bloodlines. It's not actually a messianic bloodline of Jesus. Jesus did not sire children. So this is the cover-up, making it seem like that who Jesus was not who he says he was. He was actually just a great prophet. And these messianic bloodlines are actually intermingled with these bloodlines of the quote-unquote gods, or the Nephilim. And these fallen angel bloodlines are intermingled in with the new messianic order that's coming. And what is coming out of that? Well, I've already suggested that this Antichrist, or whatever they're going to call him, is going to spawn from the union of these bloodlines. And to really look at the Merovingians in connection to the bloodlines of Christ, we have to look at the Priory of Sion records, and they connect back to a lost tribe of Benjamin that migrated to Greece, then to Germany. These records also indicate this lost tribe of Benjamin intermarried with a descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, intentionally creating the royal Merovingian dynasty. And these same Merovingians believe that they were the ordained unification of two houses of royal bloodlines descending from Israel. And these would be the house of Benjamin, Saul, and the house of Judah, David, which fascinating. And even in Merovingian lore, there's some disparity there too. And I talk about this with a lot of Gnostic lore. They don't always agree. Some of them say that the genealogical source of the Merovingians is not from Jesus, but from James, the brother of Jesus, and that this was the purpose of Rex Deus. Now, that's just a small portion of it. And from what I've gathered, a lot of modern day people who believe in these bloodlines of Jesus will actually just say that James also was intermingled into the Merovingians too. They both were. It's not just about Jesus, but the fact that it is the family of Jesus, which we talked about the Desposyni several times over the past couple episodes. And that would be essentially what the Merovingian bloodlines ended up becoming. Now, the genesis of the joint Grail and Merovingian dynasties, they actually begin with a King Lucius, and he was a supposed, you'll see this in mainstream all the time, it's not real, it's just fictional, supposed 2nd century king of the Britons, traditionally credited with introducing Christianity into Britain. And he's actually mentioned in a list of popes, and this was in 532 AD, and it actually says that Pope Eleutherius received a letter from Lucius, king of Britain, asking him to appoint a way by which Lucius might become a Christian. So this is in writing. So again, we have plenty of writings out there about a King Lucius, but of course, these artifacts are considered to be fake. But I also think that this is part of the mainstream push. I've been saying this, that if we make it seem hidden and secret, when we reveal it, it'll seem like, oh, we uncovered this master secret, the bloodlines of Jesus, and all of these kings they said weren't true. And then here come these documents out of nowhere. No, they were. And actually, this is what it is. And then everybody falls for it. And I think this is just the long con, the long game. It always has been. And Lucius was largely evangelized under Celtic Christianity, so this Gnostic form of Christianity, which included polytheism, and he was actually brought in as a part of that. And what's interesting about King Lucius, who is said to be kind of this precursor to the Merovingians, you can track his genealogy back to a King Lud of 72 BC. And when we track back King Lud, he is connected to a Welsh mythological figure, Ludlaw Errant. And Ludlaw Errant was a king of the Tuatha De Danann and the Brittonic god Nodens. So he was actually considered a god when you track back King Lucius's genealogy all the way back to this Tuatha De Danann king. So back to these Nephilim bloodlines being intermingled into these Merovingians. And King Lud was the last king of the British Celts before the Romans. Lud begot Beli, which in turn produced Bran Lear, who became Joseph of Arimathea's brother-in-law that produced King Lucius in 180 AD. So this also paralleled the Arthurian Grail bloodlines as well, especially in fictional writings about it. And then it said that King Lucius's daughter, Urgin, then married two distinct Davidic successions through Joseph of Arimathea. And one of those Davidic successions was when she married Aminadab, who was said to be the great-grandson of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So all of this is intertwined into these Merovingian bloodlines. This is why that they did and why that people who say they spawned from them even now, which are said to be intermingled into royalty in England when the Merovingians were taken out. So it's very similar to the Knights Templar. When they were taken out, they just went underground. They intermingled into these other royal houses and just rebranded, but they kept these bloodlines alive. Now, Pharamond, who is a early king of the Franks, and he's first referred to in the 8th century Liber Historiae Francorum, and it depicts him as the first king of the Franks. And again, this is one of those things where you'll have a lot of modern day scholars and historians say it's legendary or it's of legend when there's all these different writings about him. But Pharamond was said to be the first king of the Franks, and he was documented in these Priory of Sion documents as a direct messianic successor descended from Jesus through Aminadab, who married Urgin. So he trickled all the way down from Aminadab, and he was a first king of the Franks, Merovingian, and direct descendant of Jesus Christ, according to Gnostic literature. Pharamond's also talked about plenty of times in literature. I was talking about this as the King of France in Prose Tristan and later Arthurian works. William Shakespeare's Henry V. Pharamond is mentioned as the originator of the Salic law, was banning women from succession to the throne of France. So this is even talked about in Shakespeare, Pharamond. So I believe he's a real person. And I think that to suggest that some of these people didn't exist is just the modern day cover up. But again, I think it's a double cover up. You got the cover up to then do the big reveal later and say, oh, these people were covering this up. This is why you got to believe it, because it's been hidden. It's the same thing with the Gnostics claiming that they were wiped out because they had this hidden knowledge. And again, I think that was all manipulated by the powers that be behind the scenes as the long con, the long game of taking away this divinity of Jesus and what they're trying to turn it into now. So we trickle this down from Pharamond into Merovec, and Merovec is said where this Merovingian dynasty actually started, at least the idea of the Merovingians themselves. And he was the direct ancestor of the Merovingian dynasty, and he's reportedly the king of the Salian Franks. And again, mainstream will say that records of his existence are mixed with legend and myth. So at least they admit that he existed. But I do think some of the crazier aspects of the myths may have definitely been rooted in some sort of reality. So to tie Merovic directly into the bloodlines of Jesus, his legend grew in 1982 when Henry Lincoln, along with Leigh and Baigent, when we've talked about Henry Lincoln, I believe in episode 1, the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, it is hypothesized that this descended from a fish, they call the Merovingian kings the Fisher Kings, was actually referring to the concept that the Merovingian line had married into the bloodline of Jesus, since the symbol for early Christians was also a fish. And I'm going to talk directly about Pisces here in a second, and how that the age of Pisces is when Jesus was. So this would have been the idea of where these Merovingian Fisher Kings came from, because if they supposedly had the bloodlines of Jesus, then calling them the Fisher Kings would make perfect sense on so many different levels. And to get further into the speculative part of the Merovingians in Merovec, Robert Anton Wilson, he was an American writer, futurist, psychologist, and self-described agnostic mystic. Several books. He wrote this historical Illuminatus Chronicles, and he introduces the fish legend by saying that the early Merovingians appear in a vision as a hideous fish creature. He then goes further by identifying Jesus and Mary Magdalene as the bridegroom and bride in the alchemical marriage of Christian Rosycross, which that is a German book that came out in 1616 in Strasbourg, and it is of anonymous origin. However, it is attributed to Johann Valentin Andrea, who was a German theologian back in the late 1500s, 1600s. And he was one of a few people who wrote the earliest works which started Rosicrucianism. So obviously Rosicrucianism, the Rosy Cross, is tied in with all of this Merovingian lore as well. So back to Robert Anton Wilson and the book he wrote, he actually suggests that the entire bloodline of Jesus, and I've heard this before, was descended from alien human hybrids. So this is why the earliest Merovingians appeared as hideous fish creatures. And this is why that the bloodline is of the aliens or gods. And this ties right back into what I've been saying about what I think these bloodlines actually are. I don't think they are in the slightest anything to do with Jesus so much as these are these Nephilim bloodlines, these bloodlines of the gods, and they have just like slid in this whole Jesus narrative, and this is going to be the ultimate reveal in the end. It's even more interesting when we look at Merovec's mother, who in stories was impregnated by a quinotaur, which possessed characteristics like a bull, very similar to a minotaur. And we can tie that back to the religion of Poseidon and the bull cult of Canaan. We can look at Moloch as well when we're looking at the bull. And it said that Merovec's mother, while she was impregnated by this quinotaur, was simultaneously impregnated by King Claudi. And this is where I think that even though this is looked at as mythology, this rings more true to more modern day creation of Nephilim, and how that she could have been impregnated by something else not of this world. We can also look at this as legomenism, as a secret language concealing the truth. And this is what the Gnostics will say about this story, that this story of the quinotaur is actually the hidden story of the bull cult bloodlines of Atlantis, of the Nephilim. And it also ties directly to the rebellious Benjamites that we've talked about, who also had Nephilim origin as well. And this is this concoction, this conglomerate of all these bloodlines in this Merovingian bloodline. And it's interesting when these Merovingians show up, it's almost like they showed up out of nowhere and their royalty was mature, if that makes sense. So it means that when they appeared on the scene, they appeared with complete authority. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church did not like them. However, there were people within the Catholic Church that were working with them secretly. And the idea is this mysterious authority, this pedigree that they had, it derived from these alleged messianic royal bloodlines. So if they had, quote unquote, say proof, right, that we are of the bloodlines of Jesus, and they were able to showcase this, and just say that we look at the Catholic Church, at least the parts that didn't know what was going on, they would have looked at that as heresy. So that would have started that butting of heads. But if they knew they had some sort of info that they could sway the crowd with, they would have backed off from them. And that's kind of what happened with the Merovingians. Merovingians, that the Catholic Church kind of let them do what they could until they had the opportunity to take them down, which they did. But again, this is all manipulated and crafted behind the scenes with the groups that were tied into all sides, right? And we have to look at the layers of that as it's going. And if we look at the layers, because we talked about Pharamond, and he was the grandson of Boaz and Fortus, a direct descendant of Aminadab, who was the son of Jasu, son of Josephus, son of Jesus. And so Pharamond and Argata, they had Claudi, which you talked about, who had Moravius, who had Childeric, who had Clovis, who was the founder of the official Merovingian dynasty. This is how we get to the actual Merovingians. And Clovis the First was the first king of the Franks to unite all the Franks under one ruler and changed the form of leadership from a group of petty kings to rule by a single king, and ensuring the kingship was passed down to his heirs. He is considered to have been the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Frankish kingdom for the next 2 centuries. Clovis, how was he able to get all these kings to come together and him be the ruler of them all and create this Merovingian dynasty? Well, if you are claiming that you are of the bloodline of Jesus and you have some sort of proof that you can show, and you've got people who are backing it, who are in power, well, people are going to back down. They're not going to step to that. And these Fisher kings, which they became, the Merovingians, and this ties into the age of Pisces. And in astrological terms, it's generally considered to have begun around the start of the Common Era, 1 AD, and is expected to end around the year 2150 AD. And some people think we're in the age of Aquarius now, depends on who you talk to at the timelines, but we do know that most people agree that this age of Pisces is when Jesus was here. That's when it started, and that ties into the Mazzaroth too, the coming of Christ. So this age of Pisces, the age of the fish, the Fisher kings, the Merovingians, this is where this idea comes from. And these Fisher kings, according to Keith Layler, and he's an anthropologist, author, and filmmaker, and he wrote books like Head of the God, Lost Treasures of the Templars, The Divine Deception, and he talks a lot about these bloodlines of Jesus. And the research he's done, he said that the Fisher kings were said to possess mystical power to communicate with animals, manipulate the weather, heal the sick by the touching of the hands, just like Jesus. And they never cut their hair, so they kept in line with the Israeli Nazarites and looked at Samson as one of their heroes, who also never cut his hair, and that was the source of his strength. Layler also talked about that the Merovingians possessed a curious red cross-shaped birthmark located either above their heart or between the shoulder blades, and it represented their true heritage. It's also said they were sorcerer kings in the same spirit as King Solomon, and it lends to this ring lore tradition of the controlling of entities with the ring, very similar to some of the offshoot stories of King Solomon. And Merovingian kings were also polygamists, very much in the spirit of the pharaohs, David, the Nephilim, Lamech, and of course Solomon. And even though David was a man after God's own heart, and I do believe that Solomon turned from his ways in the end, they all had their problems, and the Merovingians looked at their problems as a good thing. And the Merovingians, because of the Roman Catholic Church, the mother church, held them in such high regard and fear, they actually viewed them as mysterious. So there were so many different things that were coming out about what the Merovingians were doing. Again, I think that some of the strange or weird stuff probably was going on, but I'm sure there was some stuff made up too, just because people looked at them from afar. It's very much like we do with governments, and we suspect there's a lot of crazy things going on, but we can't actually pinpoint exactly what it is. And this is where you also get the idea of the bloodline staying in-house. The Merovingian kings actually regarded their bloodlines as being so pure, they cannot be ennobled by any match. So they kept a lot of what they did in-house, so to say. And the Catholics despised the Merovingians. They actually ended up overthrowing them in 750 AD. And this lends to the idea of the Inquisitions, the wars, and the persecution of the Cathars that happened not long after that. So this is the idea that when the Catholic Church was able to take down the Merovingians, they also started trying to take down all these other Gnostic groups. But then the Merovingians and these Gnostic groups, especially the ones that said they were of the bloodlines, they went underground and just reworked themselves over into another part. And they were still working with the people who were puppeteering behind the Catholic Church as well. All this was classic, look here while we're doing this over here. And this goes to the idea that when the Merovingians went underground, they started presenting themselves as these other families. You've got the Habsburg-Lorraine family. You've got the Plantards, which we've talked about, the Luxembourgs, the Sinclairs, the Plantagenets. All of these are Rex Deus, and they're all connected to these Merovingian kings when they were overthrown by the Catholic Church. They just went underground and created these new families that eventually ended up ruling as well. And we know from Pierre Plantard that the Plantards were secretly descended from the last surviving Merovingian son of Dagobert Sigisbert IV. And he was safely housed away from the reach of Roman Catholic Church in southern France. And it said that he was also of this Jesus bloodline, is why he was hidden. And we know that the Plantards existed. We know that they were also connected to Rennes Chateau, and they were known as the ardently flowering shoot. So they were looked at as a shoot off of the Merovingian bloodline, the Rosy Cross, the Rose, the Holy Grail is essentially what they were. And this brings us back around to the last episode where Sigisbert, son of Dagobert, intermingled through marriage with other surviving Merovingian bloodlines. And part of what trickled down ended up being Godfrey de Bouillon. And we talked a lot about him in the last episode, how he was one of the leaders of the First Crusade. He was the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and also helped push the Templars into what it was. And he was considered one of the founders of the Templars, and he was part of the Priory of Sion documents and a member of Rex Deus. So he was specifically of this Merovingian descent. So this is how the Merovingians slide all the way down through the Templars and all the way through history, all the way down to what we consider in the Priory of Sion records as the Plantards. And again, back to, I know what is said about those documents. I know that they've been said to be forged and fake. Maybe they were. I'm just saying from all of the different connections that are here throughout history, we have to suggest that these bloodlines were protecting something. Were they protecting what they say they're protecting? I don't think so. I do believe that it is some sort of Nephilim bloodline origin. And I think that's really where we're going to end this episode today. Next episode, I'm going to talk specifically about the Grail stories in fiction. We're going to talk about the supposed finding of the burial place of Jesus' bones plus his family's. And then we're going to talk about Rh negative, because I think it's real important. This will bring us to the modern era of this idea and what people are saying that they have because they are Rh negative. Again, guys, I really appreciate you being here. I had a blast today, like always. Hey, guys, make sure on whatever platform you're on, go give a 5-star review. It really helps grow the show. It helps get it deeper into the algorithm, helps other people see it as well. If you're on Apple, please go write a review too. It'll only take you 30 seconds to a minute. It really helps the show grow. If you're on YouTube or Rumble, go leave a comment, like, subscribe, share. Give it to everyone you can. That's one of the biggest things you do is share. I really appreciate you guys. You free range rabbits have been excellent for a whole year. We're moving into a new year, and I appreciate all the growth. On the way out, we're going to play my new song, Imposter. You know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
I'm in a fun house, locked in a boxcar with all of these clowns. Don't feel like I belong, but maybe I do. Cause when I look in the puddle, maybe I'm just a ruse. Or maybe I'm just confused. reality's more friendly than pretend. And I don't know if my perception's innocent. I'm never satisfied, I'm looking to transcend. Real me gets confused with the clones I create on my own. My palace corridors to the lab, it's a throne. Pyramids of deception above the halls of a minty. If I leave, will I even miss me? Yeah. Face to face with my ambition, yeah. My position with me, I'm in competition, yeah. I could be superstitious, cause it feels like it's a sickness. What you